Hello everyone, my name is Oliver and in this video I will be taking a look at my workflow as to how I create TeamMaker Toolkit items. So originally what I had planned for this video was me showing the process of actually creating an item. So I was recording that a moment ago, but in the end I ended up having a few issues and having to go back a lot. And I figured that wouldn't be interesting to look at. So instead we'll be having a look at this item after the fact and be walking through the steps to see how I actually made this. So the reason I'm making this video is because I get a lot of questions about what tools I use and how I use them. So I figured this would be a good time to show you guys that and also give some tips and tricks on how you can create objects for Planet Coaster that kind of fit in within Planet Coaster, at least. That's always my aim. So originally what my aim was for creating Planet Coaster items, and what was also just a really big focus for me in general, is like I said, making the fit in within Planet Coaster. This also means performance-wise, but also artistically as well. So that's where this image came in that I prominently showed with my first set, the water slide set, and have been using ever since. So the icons may be a little misleading, I'd say, but the text kind of explains what I mean by them. And the original idea of this image was to kind of show to people that I cared about these things, because back when I originally created the water slide set, not a lot of people were paying attention to performance. Creating objects with thousands and thousands of triangles, and I mean that's just going to slow everyone's game down. So I figured I'd try to raise some attention for this issue and hopefully get other creators as well to kind of think about these performance issues as well. So like I said, I made the water slides set, and I've been making other sets as well over the past, what is it? I guess it's about a year, I guess. And right now I'm working on another set. Let me really quickly show you. Recently I saw the, what is it called again? The Void in Disney Village, I think it was. And basically what it is like a VR space where you can actually walk around as well. And they have walls and stuff like that and things to interact with in real life as well. So if you run up to a wall, you can actually touch it basically and interact with it to kind of lower, I guess heighten the immersion even more. Anyways, so I created this VR headset. It's a little bit modeled after the HTC Vive. It's looking pretty good in here. That's because this preview is using a 2K texture, I think. Of course, when I put it into the game, it will have a much lower resolution, as this is a really small object. So it doesn't need to have a very high texture density. So let's talk about that first. The texel rate is what it's called. The texel rate is basically, let's say that we have a meter by a meter or something. How much pixels do we give that meter by meter? Actually, Planet Coaster provided that in their guide. And as the guide states, that would ideally be about, for a meter by meter, that would be 256 pixels by 256 pixels, all right? So if you're making a wall that's 4x4, that would be 512 by 512, all right? So keep these numbers in mind and actually stick to them. Don't think like, my object is much more amazing and, it should be 4K. Don't do that. It's unnecessary. Your object won't fit into the game. Because basically all the items in Planet Coaster use this texel rate. So if you zoom in on your item and it has a much higher texel rate or a much lower texel rate, that really shows, all right? And also performance. If you're making a TMUG, it does not have to be a 4K image. That's just crazy. It's going to slow everyone's game down. It's going to limit the amount of items that these people can put into their games. You don't want to be a creator like that, alright? So keep those things into mind. Alright, so on to what I was actually making. Let me show you. So this is the actual HTC 5. And in the back here you can see these beacons. I think they are called lighthouses or something. Anyways, they're basically little boxes that you put on the walls or ceiling in the corners of your room. And they basically allow you to track your position within the room, alright? So they actually see this HTC 5 walking around. And that's basically how they track position in a space. So if you have a larger space, let's say like in the void, you might have more of these trackers basically around the room to actually allow for all this tracking to happen. So that's actually what I was making. I always try to kind of, whenever I make an item, kind of make a set of items that work together. So that I can kind of release it as a collection. So that's my plan for this set as well. I'm not quite sure what else I'm going to be adding. Perhaps some kind of laser gun or something. I'll have to think about that. But anyways, the focus is on creating a simple lighthouse. So the reason I chose this object is also because it's really simple. Alright, it's basically just a box with some rounded edges. Alright. But it does have some interesting material, so it does allow me to show you what extra things go into making such an object, alright? So, where do I start off? Well, I start off with just modeling the very basics. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Alright, just gonna disable that one. There you go. This is actually all there is to it, to the basic shape. This is the low poly model. I'm using a process where you use something that's called baking. And what baking actually allows you to do is you make a low poly version of your model, just like this one, and a high resolution version, like this one, which has a lot more detail, as you can tell. And then it allows you to project these details onto the low poly version, alright? So whenever I make an object, I actually always create two versions, right? I tend to always start off with the low poly one and then add the details to that to create a high poly one. You can do it the other way around as well. It just depends on what you prefer. So this method of baking is actually a feature that's available in Blender. That's not what I personally use though. I personally use Substance Painter. I will be showing that in a second, so you have an idea of what that looks like. And that kind of goes for most things that I'm showing in this video, because I am using some paid software like Substance Painter, which is a really expensive product. If you don't have access to such a tool, I personally have a student license, so that's why I was able to get it. But if you don't have access to these tools, there are alternatives. And actually most of the features are even available in Blender itself already, which of course is a free piece of software. So you can always choose to do that instead, alright? Alright, so about this object, there are some interesting things about this object. First of all, you can see that it has rounded corners. You may think like, alright, that's not too special, it's just some smoothing, right? Well, yeah, but there is a little bit more to this than just a normal smoothing. Whenever people create an object in Blender and they smooth it, it will probably look like this. And there is a really big issue with this. It may look fine, like at first, but if you look really closely, you can actually tell that there's a gradient going on the top and the side and the bottom, even though these are supposed to be flat surfaces, right? Actually, a lot of objects on the workshop have this issue. Alright, so really watch out that you don't get an item that has this, because it will look terrible in game if you turn it around, look around it, right? Because it will just seem odd. So actually, what is going on here is Blender is actually trying to smooth this entire surface, just everything. Alright, and that's not what we want. So basically, Blender is treating this object as if it is completely round, which isn't the case. Only these parts should be rounded, and the rest should still stay flat. Well, alright, you might think, well, why don't we mark these sides as flat? Yeah, that's not gonna work, because that's gonna disable the smoothness on the others as well. Alright, so how do you fix that then? There is a way to do it with Blender, and that's by duplicating vertices and stuff like that. I don't recommend doing that though. There's a really big issue with that, and that is that by duplicating vertices, you're also increasing the poly count and stuff like that. You don't want to do that, alright? So instead what I like to use is a plugin called YAVNE, I think it's called. YAVNE. And it allows you to say what the influence is of each face, alright? So right now each face has an equal influence. It's currently set to medium. But if I decide to select all the faces that should be flat and say that they have a strong influence, you'll see that it looks alright, because the top and the sides and the bottom are now actually flat and are influencing this medium face to become rounded, because these are strong, this one's medium one loses, so that's the one who will smooth out. Alright, I highly recommend getting this plugin. It's going to be really helpful, especially if you have some smoothness going on, and even with just fabricated objects and stuff like that, you're gonna have that smoothness. So it's kind of just a must-have. Alright, one example of this not being done and it looking really weird is Geekism made an amazing counter, cash register, and he had this issue, and basically what that means is that the sides of it looked really weird and the lighting was all weird on it and stuff like that. You can solve that with YAVNE, alright? So make sure you get that plugin. It's on the internet, you can find it on GitHub, and it will save you a lot of trouble with lighting later on. Alright, right, moving on to UVing. Alright, so a really large part, of course, of creating objects is getting the textures on there. And to create the textures, we create our UVs to tell like where our textures are gonna be. Alright, and on what sides they should show up. Personally, what I like to do is I go into my object and I mark the seams where I would like the seams to be. Usually that would be in places where they are least noticeable. Obviously you can't always do that, but try to do that, because you know it'll look better in the end if they are a little hidden, or at least as hidden as they can be. Then I just select all my faces, I go into unwrap, and I just go with confirm all, and that usually creates a really nice map that's already pretty good to go. Alright, actually you can't really see it very well, that's better. Then I try to move them around to kind of get more out of my texture space. Alright, in this case there isn't much that I can do. But if we have something different, I'm just gonna move this. It's gonna look really ugly, don't do this. But let's say we have something like this. There are more efficient ways of packing this, alright? So I try not to scale any islands. Let's say this one just happens to be smaller, alright? Again, don't scale them. Just keep them the same size, move them around a bit, and sometimes you can find these arrangements that allow you to scale all of them up in the arrangement that you have them in. Alright, and it just means that you have used your texture a bit more efficiently. Alright, let's move back really quickly and have a look at what that colorful thing was. It's a really nice thing when you're texturing something. It's always a good idea to go in the bottom here, click on new, generate a type, color grid, and that will give you this grid. And what that allows you to do is basically kind of see the text array. All right. In the end, you kind of want all the squares to be roughly the same size on every single side. And usually what you would also want to do, which I didn't do for this object, which is kind of stupid, is make things the right side up as well. All right, so in this case I'll rotate this one 180 degrees just so it's the right side up. That will make texturing later on a little bit easier. All right, so try to do that. All right, once I have all of that done, it's actually you can already export this low poly version of the model, and then I always like to go into my high poly model, and this is where I actually go crazy with the details and just add all these tiny little details that have a lot of polys in them, because you can. This is not going to cost any performance because we'll just be baking them into the textures that we have later. For the UVing of this one, it is always good to have a UV on it. I usually just generate a new one because it will otherwise have overlaps in places that I don't want it, because I was still using the old UV map. I just unwrap it to conform all, call it a day, and be done with it. All right, this one doesn't really matter. This is not the one that you'll in the end actually be using. All right, with all of that out of the way, I just export this one as well, called high. Let's actually go into the export really quickly. We'll do that on the low poly one first, because it's going to be the same for the high one as well. Just go to export, just export it like usual. All right, the actual item that you will eventually be exporting to the TMTK needs some specific settings though. So I actually made a preset for that. It's called Planko. And it has a few settings that are different, all right? Some are the defaults. I'm just gonna name the ones that I know work. Version, set that to binary. Forward, set it to -C forward. Up, set it to Y up. And most importantly, enable this experimental feature, all right? If you don't have this enabled, your lighting will look weird. That's the issue that everyone is having when they first create an object. You need this enabled. Heck, just make a preset for it so you never have to worry about it again. Just make sure that's enabled. Otherwise, it will look all messed up in Blended Coaster. All right, that's about it for Blender, for me at least. You might be able to bake your details in Blender, but this is where I will be moving on to Substance Painter. Right, so here I have my high resolution FBX and my low resolution FBX. Then what I do is I create a Substance Painter file with my low FBX. All right, so let's have a look at what that looks like. If it will load. Yeah, it will. All right, great. Let's wait for that. So, how's your day? Good? Oh, nice. All right, there you go. Well, not really. It's not really working yet. All right, let's give it a second. There you go. No, we'll do that some other time. Not gonna bother you with that one. All right, so once I load that up into Substance Painter, you can see it already has textures. I already created those. But it will actually show you the model. And next thing you are going to be doing is baking the high poly model onto this, all right? Actually, I'm going to press new. I'm going to really quickly show you because otherwise you can't really tell. So for my new file, I'm loading my low poly mesh. The document resolution, this can be higher than the one that you eventually want. Once you export it though, that's when you have to really worry about what your resolution should be. This is a really small item. So actually the texture resolution for this object is 128 by 128. But just for the sake of working with it, I'm choosing a higher resolution because it allows me to add smaller details that will still be able to be conveyed once you actually see the object in a lower resolution. All right. So this is what you see when I first loaded up. This is just a model that we had in Blender. And this is kind of what it will look like if you're trying to bake it in Blender as well. And then what I can actually do is I can select the high poly version. All right. There you go. And bake a normal map. I can bake an ambient occlusion map and all sorts of other maps that can be useful. The normal map and ambient occlusion maps are the most important ones though, because those are actually maps that we are going to be able to include with our TMTK item as well. And they will add a lot of nice little details if you do this correctly, alright? The other maps can be useful as well, but just for the texturing of other maps, alright? So I'm just going to bake my maps. And now what you'll see is that this object is actually starting to look like our high poly model. Well, in reality, it really isn't, because this is just the normal map that shows these details, alright? So we have this little ridge here, and I can show you. If you go into the normals, nope, not that one, the other one. You can see this is just done with normal maps. And this is really great, because we now have a lot more detail without actually having to have more polys, and that's just perfect. That's gonna help us a lot. All right. So really do that. Use the workflow of using a low poly model and a high poly model, baking it down, because it will give you a really solid base to work from. All right. So once you have that, you can start painting materials on there. Just whatever you like, right? And this is also a really important aspect of the process, all right? So right now I'm using this tool that has all these awesome materials as well. Substance Painter hasn't always been part of my workflow though. I have used different workflows as well. So I'm really quickly gonna talk about that, because that's probably how you're gonna work instead of using Substance, all right? So Planet Coaster uses a PBR workflow. That means physics-based rendering. And what it does is it kind of tries to emulate the way that light in real life works as well. Previously in games, what would usually be done is you just have a base color, all right? That's like the actual color that your object has. That could be a wood texture, for example. And later they thought like, hey, this is really boring. Every surface kind of looks the same. Some things reflect more than others, and that's where the specular map came in, and that added some glossiness to the whole thing, right? Kind of like this. And eventually people broke it down to a few different features that you would need to have to basically create any type of material that you might ever need. All right. This is the base color. This is the normal map, this is the metallic map, it's the roughness map, it's a emissive map, all these kind of textures that will allow you to define on a per pixel basis what the object should be like, all right, and how it should reflect light instead of what it should directly look at like. Why am I telling you this? Because just looking up a wood texture is not gonna work, all right? If you think that you can just grab this texture, put it onto your object and call it a day, it will look ugly, all right? The reason being, it will just look like plastic that looks like wood, all right? The light doesn't reflect any differently across this surface. Well, in reality, this is a pretty rough surface and there are all these dents in there and stuff like that. And you're not keeping that, taking that into account if you just slap this texture onto your object. So instead, what I recommend you to do is just look for CC0, which just means public domain. Just means that you can legally use these images without getting sued. That's always a nice thing. CC0, PBR materials, and see what you get. There are these two websites that I mostly use. It's cc0textures.com and freepbr.com. And they have wonderful materials. All PBR materials that are completely free for you to use. All right. So let's say that you need some kind of metal. This is where you would go into metals. There you go. And just find the thing that you like. I like this one because it's actually a really good example for PBR. Reason being, the paint bits reflect a lot less than the metal bits, as you can tell. So there's a lot of different kind of things going on the surface. You can just grab these textures, and what you'll see is that it will actually give you a bunch of different maps that you may already know from the Team Maker's toolkit. All right. Let's see if it works. Yes, it does. All right. All right, there you go. So let's really quickly have a look at those. Just gonna make a folder. All right. New folder. Let's have a look. All right, so we have an ambient occlusion file. All right, looks like an ambient occlusion map. We get the albedo, which is that's just your base color. You get the metalness, and this is where you can really see what PBR kind of meant to be like. Because all the metal bits on here are white, all the non-metal bits are made black. We have a normal map, which will show some depth on the edges of the paint. And we have our roughness map, which will also, just like the metalness, will influence the way how much light is reflected on these surfaces, all right? And this is important. Basically, any type of material that you want to put on your model, make sure they have at least a few of those maps on there, because otherwise it's gonna look really boring. It's not gonna fit into the game, right? One last thing to keep in mind, and this is why I would probably never really use this specific texture unless I really want it to be in the scene, is this texture looks really worn, all right? This material is really made to look like it's been there around for ages. And I'm not quite sure if this, Planet Coaster Frontier tells us in the guide as well. But they have said that the style that they have for Planet Coaster is basically everything is new, but a few days old, all right? So there are little bits of wear and tear everywhere. That rhymes. But nothing is really worn down like you would probably see in real life. Additionally to that, colors are a bit more vibrant, all right? And really, if you keep these two things in mind, you'll be able to create pretty convincing assets that look as if they were made by Frontier, all right? Alongside all the other things to keep in mind, of course. But as for the artistic style, this is kind of the basics for the materials, all right? All right, so with our textures baked, we can, of course, start painting them with our materials. There are hundreds of ways to do that. One thing that I kind of forgot to tell about, which I should probably show you, that makes this whole process a lot easier, is, as you can tell, on the high resolution version of my model, I have 3 different materials. While on the low poly version, I just have 1, all right? Because most objects, you should only need 1 material, all right? This one has 3. The reason for that is that most baking tools allow you to render out these colors. And then what you get is a map that is extremely useful for painting the materials on there. Because they can act as masks, all right, to mask out certain places. So in my case, for example, the red front bit of the model is a bit that I want to look more shiny, all right? So let's have a look. This bit is very shiny because this is where the sensors, like the sensors are behind this, and this cover is just there to kind of hide these sensors, right? That's what you would see in real life as well. Well, the other bits are more just a generic plasticky, just pretty new plastic. And it's probably even a little too smooth. I probably want to add a bit more to that. And then the back is just plastic as well, right? And that's kind of what I was going for here. Let me see if I can find what that looks like. Yeah, here's the color ID map. So it just is a map with based on your UV coordinates as well, of course, with the colors in the right places, basically, and then you can use that as a mask to mask out certain places. So in my case, for example, for this front bit, I have a mask here that's based on this color mask, and then I apply the glossy texture to the entire the entire model basically, but it's only masked out to this little bit. All right. So that's basically why I do that. All right, so once I have all that in place, I can start exporting the materials, the textures, I mean. In Substance Painter, I created a preset for this because, as you'll probably know, the way you name these textures for TMTK to understand them is by naming the material name and then underscore BC or underscore AO, underscore F1, so on and so forth. If you happen to need this, just really quickly copy what I have here right here. So I select that preset and then it'll show me, they'll export the right textures. And in this case, I am exporting them as a 128 by 128 texture. All right. I'm actually outputting that to a specific folder. This is basically the folder that I output to. All right. So these are the textures outputted by Substance Painter. And then there really is one last step that we have to take to finish the model and make it work. All right. So let's have a look at what that is. So once I'm done with the high and lows, I tend to just copy my Blender file. And in this Blender file, I only have the low poly model. And this is where I create the LODs. So at this point, I will have already tried them out in the game just to see if the textures that I have work well. Because creating the LODs can take a little while. All right. I have not yet set up the LODs for this object. So right now it's just a copy of the same thing. That being said, this will only have 2 LOD levels. Just this version and one as a square. Because there really isn't more that I can do to decrease the poly count. You really don't have to, it's just a cube. All right. But anything bigger than this, it's gonna need LODs. All right. So don't forget to do your LODs. All right. That's another tip. No, it's not even a tip. Just do that. It's a necessity. All right. Basically, if you're not making LODs, you're probably a bit of a dick because you are ruining their performance. Right. And you might say like, well, it's just one object that the person will place down. And it's only me who's doing that, so it shouldn't, ruin their performance. Well, you're part of the problem. Don't do that. Just make your LODs. Be a good boy. Just make your LODs. All right. So for my LODs, what I like to do is I start off with my highest LOD level, which is just a model that I already created. Then I just copy them, name it, go into the model, and this is where I start removing details. And usually I just do that by dissolving edges, right? That's not a very good example, but you get what I mean, right? Because if you do that, you can kind of slowly but surely remove details in places that aren't really necessary and reduce the poly count that way. So one thing you might notice though is I am doing this manually. There is a way to do this automatically. I'm personally not a big fan of it though. It's called Decimate. This is what most people will tend to use. And this allows you to decrease the poly count as well, all right? And as you can already tell, it is messing things up and it doesn't look very good, all right? And that's exactly why I don't like using it. All right, this one is actually fine. Yeah, I'd be able to use that. Generally speaking, it might mess things up. This really works better for organic shapes and not really for fabricated shapes, all right? It kind of depends on what you prefer though. In the end, you're still reducing poly, so you're still doing your good homework. I just personally prefer to do it manually, and I think that's a better way of doing it. All right, with that out of the way, I have all my LOD levels set up. There's one last optional thing that I can decide to do, and that's a hit check. All right, there's this object that you can call hit check _01, and I believe you can have up to 3, and it allows you to create a what is it called again? A non-concave shape to act as the collider for your object. All right. So if you're inside of the game and you try to click your object, this is what you will actually be clicking. If you don't supply this one, Planet Coaster will just make a box around your object. All right. So for this specific object, you might say like, hey, but then you don't really need that custom bounding box because like, I mean, it's already a box, so it's just gonna generate a perfectly fine bounding box for you, right? Yes, but I'm kind of cheating the system here. This is a little trick that I found out to overcome the minimum size of objects, all right? So as you might know, the limit in terms of size is 8 by 8 by 8 meters. And there's also, you can only make your object so small, right? So an easy way to overcome that is inside of your model, you just tap into it, go into edit mode, grab a vertex, all right? And this is really cheaty. Don't judge me. Shift D to duplicate it, then move it somewhere else really far away to make your object bigger without actually making it visibly bigger. And that's how you do it. Actually, you can see the vertex here that I use right now. Just make it, put that somewhere else to make it big enough. And you do need this on every single LOD level, all right? So I recommend doing this before you create your LODs. And then the reason why I now need my custom bounding box is because if Blender Coaster is now generating a bounding box around it, it'll suddenly be this really large box. And just if you like click right here, you will even be selecting this little cube, right? And that's not what you want. That being said though, the bounding box also needs this trick because otherwise Blender Coaster will still complain that your object is too small. All right, so again, this little cube has a spare vertex over there as well. And this really won't influence a thing. It's just there to cheat the system. All right. There are no triangles connected to it. It's not going to render. Nothing's going to happen to it. It's just there for the sake of getting around some of those limits. All right. Once I have all these LOD levels and hit checks and all that set up, it's time for me to export again. FBX, and make sure to use the preset that you made. Or enable this feature, it's really important. All right. I export that to the same folder that I was just looking at. So here I have my FBX, here I have my maps. And as you can see, I also have the image or the icon set up. Let's have a look at how I do that. Generally, my workflow for that is I use Substance Designer just for this right now. Reason being, I have Substance Designer set up in such a way that I can really easily make this image. Yeah, there you go. All my images are trying to mimic the icons that Blender Coaster has, and I can really easily do that in Substance Designer by just resetting my position, moving around a bit, and this kind of gives me a pretty good angle for an icon. I usually set it to eye gray. This object isn't really good for that though, because it has some issues where the shadow is casting on itself. So this is not what I use for this specific object, but generally speaking, this is what I use. I use the eye-ray renderer because it looks a lot better. I mean, it's the icon, so it's going to be really small, but having this extra quality will show up in the icon. And the things that you lose because of the resolution will gain because it will have a bit more better lighting in the icon itself. You can do this in Blender as well. Just render your object in Blender. Just make sure that you have all the textures set, and also make sure that your background is transparent. Once you have all of that done, I tend to just save the render, save it to image. Because I didn't use the eye-ray renderer for this specific image, I then had to remove the background really quickly. And this is where I crop the image to a square and then scale it down to a 356 by 256 image for my icon. And that always really works really well for me. The software I use for that is Paint.net. Paint.net again is also a free piece of software. You can just about use any kind of software for this. I tend to work really quickly with Paint.net, so that's what I like to use for this specific thing. But again, just what works for you. So yeah, that's really all there is to this. Let me really quickly show you. So I have my object, I changed the canvas scale to make that a square. Just really quickly remove the top and the bottom part. This is where I resize my image to 256 by 256, and then I just save it. Probably usually also kind of reposition it, kind of make it look centered, or at least make it visually centered. And then save it as my icon. There you go. Then next up, just select everything. Well, this one isn't there yet. Select everything except for my image file. Just gonna keep that because I tend to use that for promotional art and stuff like that. Compress zip file, and this is where we can upload it to our TeamMaker's toolkit. That's really all there is to it. All right. This is how I make my objects. This is basically what I've been doing. My workflow has changed a few times. This specific object, this beacon object, can be made a lot simpler, can be made a lot faster. I just chose to do the full workflow for this object just because I wanted to show you guys how it is, how I do it. So you can see the same thing for my headset. This is where I was still kind of trying to nail down this workflow. I only recently switched to Substance Painter. But it basically comes down to the same. You have your image, you have your icon, you have your textures in there. Got my high and my low. And even for my water slides, it is really just the same. This one is a bit more messy though, because I obviously have a lot of different pieces. I think it's about like 20 of them or something. So again, just trying to find some different workflows that are fast and work well, just so I can continue making these assets without them taking too much time, because it is a really big time sink. Something like the headset, that probably took me, let's think, it probably took me about 4 hours to put that together. And then you also have to take into account that you have to upload it to the workshop. To the TeamMaker's toolkit, I mean, and this is a really big issue with the TMTK and why it's so damn tough to use. Sadly, the TMTK isn't always the fastest. Usually it will take at least a minute to build your object, take a minute to upload the object, and it can take hours to get out of the queue, because if anyone else is also uploading items, or even just an entire set of items with just a ton of stuff, well, you're in for a wait, because you're not getting your items done before that other person is done. And this is a really big issue. I really hope Frontier will be able to change these things around, because once you have them I've had them going through the TMTK. You need to put them inside of your Frontier folder, TMT items, boot up boot up Planet Coaster, which will also take half an hour. It won't take half an hour, but it still takes, I think it takes like 5 minutes currently. Put your item into the game and take a look at it. Speaking of which, let's open up Planet Coaster and have a look at this item in game, because I forgot we actually have to do that as well. Anyways, what I was saying, in the end, it just takes a really long time. And usually once you have seen it in game, there are always things that you want to change, or at least that's generally what I have. I'll find things that I don't think work really well, so I want to go back and change them up to work better. Having to go through this process of booting up Planet Coaster a few times, it's just... it really sucks. So Frontier, if you're listening, please, for the love of God and for the love of creators like me who just really want to create items but are just discouraged by the amount of time it takes to do this, please do something about it. Alright, so while we're waiting for my park to load, I'm really quickly going to think if there are any other really important things that I should think about. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask them. Just keep in mind, I have personally not done animations yet, alright? I haven't found any need to use animations in any of my sets yet, which is why I haven't really delved into that aspect of the models yet. So I won't really be helpful with questions about animations, because there are some differences, especially regarding exporting it. But anything else, I should be able to help you out if you're having trouble. That said, though, read the guide really well. This is really a thing that I learned right from the start. Right when the TMTK came out, I was one of the 3 people who jumped on it and tried it out. And I think I even had the first object that had textures in the game, which was a really crappy roof piece. Which has way too many subscribers, by the way, on the workshop. But read the guide, because there is actually a lot of good information in it. It's just not formulated really well. It's just really hard to find things. But in the end, a lot of the information is in there. So once you kind of get the hang of this whole TMTK thing, just go through the whole thing again, because you'll find a lot of information to be really helpful in the end. Anyways, here's our object. As you can see, I really toned down the resolution on this item. It's a really small item, so we really don't need it. Let's compare it to a peep. It's rather large. It's larger than a real life equivalent. That's on purpose, though. Which may sound silly because, you know, Planet Coaster has this rule of scaling things up by 120%. But items at this scale, let's be honest, if this was any smaller, you barely even see it at any point in time. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. It's a little bit big. Anyways, but as you can see, it has these details. It's not looking as good at it as it was in our other software. But again, it's a small object. So this kind of matches up with the amount of detail that you would have on any other object. Just move really closely to any other objects and kind of compare it to your own object, and you'll find that it's actually... If you choose the right text array, it should actually be fine. All right. So yeah, that's kind of how things are. So these are just really small items. But if you're making something a little bit bigger, you can of course see these details much better, right? Let's have a look at this tube that I made. You can really see that's like this inflatable tube. Got details on the handles, which is all done through normal maps. This is a really low poly model actually, because it's still pretty small. And again, keeping into account this textile rate that you have to work with, right? One last tip, by the way, when you're making your objects, is really think about like where should how should I position this within the scene, and how should I rotate it, all right? So, for example, I have this emergency exit sign, which I needed myself, which is exactly why I made them. And the origin of this object is at the bottom of the object. Reason being, otherwise, if I want to place it on a wall, it will actually sink into the wall like this, and that's not what I want, alright? Just keep in mind that you want to make your object as easy to use as possible for other people. So really think about where your snapping position should be, alright? Another example being my slide set. If you have a look at it, this might seem a little bit odd, and you know, not really keeping in mind what I was just saying. Also, this has a reason, because now if I want to make a full tube, all I have to do is just copy it, enable angle snap, of course, rotate it around. There you go. That's all you have to do. So try to think like what would work best for your object. All right. If it's something that you place on the wall, just put it onto the ground flat in Blender, because then if you try to put it on the wall, it will actually rotate correctly. If you have align to surface on, which is what most people will be doing if they're trying to place things onto walls. So keep that into account. As you can see, the icon worked out really well as well. It's a bit dark, so I'll probably go back and change it a little bit, change the contrast a bit. Another example, here's the VR headset. Let's actually put it on someone's head, because we can. There you go. Beautiful. I tried making this as large as a head, basically. All the heads in Planet Coaster are all different sizes, but this one worked pretty well. Again, if you go close to it, you will see that this is a really low resolution texture on there. But again, that doesn't really matter because it's a really small object, so it doesn't really need a lot of detail. Because if you're looking from over here, right, which is what you'll usually see it at, it looks perfectly fine. Actually, the normal. Oh wait. All right, there's an issue with the normals there on the LOD. That's good to see. I'll have to fix that. So yeah, test them out into the game. Just go back if there's something wrong, right? So I'll be fixing my LODs here. Just make quality your highest priority, because in the end, quality and performance friendliness is what will make people use your items. All right. Because in the end, it's great that we have the TMTK, but as long as you know, it's no more efficient than putting down 1,000 pieces for your roof just to make, you know, a roof that looks nice with every single shingle being a single piece. You're not gonna make that's not making the game happy. So make sure you make high quality items that still just work well performance wise. All right. Anyways, I think that's about it for this video. I hope that it has been able to be of any use. It's a little bit long, but I think it's packed with information that might be useful to you. Anyways, have a very nice day, and that's about it for today. See you later.